other times that I went much younger, but this was the first time I went. For those of you who may not know, I am the oldest of 6, and so family of 8 heading to Disney World, you don't exactly go to the super nice resorts they have there. You find the cheapest way to make Disney World happen for your kids, and that way was through a pop-up camper behind our 12-passenger van, so you can get kind of sort of the idea. Uh-oh, that's not working. That's not working. Okay. 1 second. 1 second. Oh, got it. Okay, so you can get kind of this idea. So that's sort of the 12-passenger van we have. I don't know who takes scenic pictures of their 12-passenger van like this, but this is what I found, like kind of a stock image. So this is kind of almost exactly the 12-passenger van we had, and then a pop-up camper behind it. So we were hauling some serious luggage, if you know what I mean. And so while we were driving there, so we're driving from East Tennessee and all the way to Orlando, Florida, we are going through Atlanta. And Atlanta traffic can get pretty hectic. And as my dad is very calmly driving a 12-passenger with a pop-up camper hitched behind it, all of a sudden, a wheel came off of the car in front of us. And my dad had to swerve around the wheel and just get into another lane, and nothing happened to us. But it was very chaotic. But what made a huge difference is that my dad was so calm and collected during this event that we would have never known it happened. He was so steady and so stable right at the wheel of some pretty serious hauling in the back. He was so calm and steady that we never would have known that something terrible could have happened to us. And similarly, what we see in our story for today, the passage that we'll be looking at, we meet a very calm Jesus napping in the face of a storm before he calms it. So I'm going to read for us. We're going to be in Luke chapter 8, verse 22 is where I'll start, if you'd like to follow along. So this is a very common story that many of you may have heard. And it's also a story that if you've heard it preached before, you've probably heard the same things over and over again about it, like focus on Jesus in the eye of the storm, but we'll take a little bit of a different route with it today. So start in Luke 8, chapter 8, verse 22. So one day Jesus said to his disciples, "Let us go over to the other side of the lake." So they got into a boat and set out. As they sailed, he fell asleep. A squall came down on the lake so that the boat was being swamped, and they were in great danger. The disciples went and woke him, saying, "Master, Master, we're going to drown." He got up and rebuked the wind and the raging waters. The storm subsided, and all was calm. "Where is your faith?" he asked his disciples. In fear and amazement, they asked one another, "Who is this? He commands even the winds and the water, and they obey him." Move to the next slide. There we go. All right. I want you to take a few moments just right off the bat around your table to just what are some of the observations that you have the first time we come to this text. So we'll do a few minutes of that, and then we'll come back afterwards. So break. All right, let's come back in. And what are some of the initial, just shout out. You can raise your hand if you want to. You don't have to. This isn't a classroom. But just shout out some initial observations and reflections you have about the story we're reading for today. Yeah. Well, thank you for those observations. I appreciate that. And it's so interesting to think about how young they are. I've never thought about that. Let's take a second. If we're viewing this text like a picture, let's take a second to kind of zoom out. I don't know about you, but some of the we'll say some of the older people in my life, when they're looking at pictures, they will, or if they're taking a picture, they'll either zoom in like this or they'll zoom out. Let's think about zooming out for a second. So when we look at kind of the background of what's going on, Jesus has just said, hey, let's go over to the other side of the lake. So for context, if you're thinking about the Sea of Galilee, this is where they were, kind of in the middle of the sea right there as this storm is happening. And they're going from one stretch of where they are to the other. And so the Sea of Galilee, you would never know in some pictures of it that it would create these huge treacherous storms because a lot of the pictures that you see, they're very pristine, very peaceful, very calm. But it was known for having these awful, awful storms like the one the disciples and Jesus were caught in today. This particular stretch that they were going through was about 5 miles long. And in the first century, water in particular, and any type of body of water, there was a lot of great superstition surrounding water and things. For example, like monsters like Leviathan and things like that. It was very commonly known that and also like the water is a pretty there's a lot of mystery to it. There's a lot of unknowns that you can encounter while you're in the water, while you're sailing through. And so you got to remember, even though the disciples are young, a lot of them are experienced fishermen. And so for them to be scared on a boat is pretty serious, and it means that the storm is a big one. And so this is kind of setting the scene for what we're encountering and the different emotions that they're experiencing while we look at the text. So we have all of them in a boat together in the midst of the storm. And again, like I said, Jesus is napping, unbothered and unmoved by the chaos surrounding him. So we have to, if you remember, following Jesus and like saying that he was going to be a rabbi, it wasn't like a weekend in Paris. There was a lot of movement going around as they were traveling with him. And so Jesus is like, okay, we're going from this place to the next. And they just have to move on and go with him, which for many of us would be a tall task. Like it wouldn't be something that would be super easy for us to just move from one place to the other. And so we think about the different healings that took place beforehand, and then right after this storm that they encounter, Jesus goes, here's what he leaves and he goes to, is that he drives out a demon from pigs. So this is all a very crazy, chaotic story. Although Jesus is doing great things and doing miracles, there's a lot of movement going on, and some could really call it chaos. And it seems like what Jesus is trying to draw out of his disciples is, despite all this movement and chaos that is going on in the story, he wants them to develop a non-anxious posture towards life. And I think the key to understanding this particular passage is in the question that Jesus asks the disciples. So he asked them, where is your faith? Implying that whatever their reaction to this circumstance is the opposite of what their faith in action is supposed to look like right now. That whatever faith looks like, that it is the opposite of complete and utter terror and panic. That it looks more like the calm and steady posture of Jesus in this circumstance. Now, when I think about this scene, I also think of a similar scene in The Office. Okay, so there's an episode, not everyone has seen The Office, that's okay, but I've watched it many, many times. There's a scene in particular in a story where Dwight, one of the main characters, decides that he wants to test how well everyone in the office would respond to an emergency. So, as any sane person would do, he lights a cigarette in the office and throws it in the trash and says, okay, let's see how everyone responds. And much to everyone's surprise, it does not go well. Like a cat goes up through the ceiling. Not right now, George. A cat goes up through the ceiling, and there are people trying to get out. And everyone is asking the boss, Michael Scott, played by Steve Carell, what are we supposed to do? They're looking to the leader to tell them what to do. And he's like, stay calm, stay calm. And then finally he yells, stay calm. That's the last thing you want to hear from a leader in this circumstance when really, really chaotic things are going on is stay calm. Like, if you could be calm, you would be calm right now because it's an emergency, actually. And so, unlike Michael Scott, unlike the people in this office, despite the chaos that is going on in this story, Jesus is unmoved and unbothered by it. But also, as we'll talk about later, there's also a great limitation being shown by Jesus. He's napping. He was tired from all the things that they had been doing. So again, the opposite of what was going on is what Jesus expected. There's this posture in the kingdom of God that is able to look at a storm and be unmoved and unbothered by the circumstance. There's this ability to have peace despite the circumstance that is being faced. So it's clear that Jesus is the calm person in this scene. It's very, very clear that he's the calm, steady, and stable one. And when I was kind of thinking about this, I thought we've talked a lot about here. I know Christian and JD have both talked a little bit about family systems theory. And there was this guy in the 90s named Edwin Friedman who took that research and came out with a book called The Failure of Nerve. And in this, what he was taking the theory all about family systems theory. The idea behind it is that anxiety is contagious. And that often, when you're in a room, when you're a part of a system, a family, a company, a congregation, that often what ends up happening is that we catch the anxiety of other people. And you know what I'm talking about. If you've ever been in a room with your family, if you've ever been around one of your most anxious family members, we tend to succumb to the pressure of the most anxious person in the room. And so what he kind of theorized, and out of much research, is that in order to kind of counteract the anxiety of the room, of the systems that we find ourselves in, the most important thing, this was in leadership, is that a non-anxious presence is injected in the midst of this anxiety. And that this non-anxious presence helps to heal. It's like a balm to the anxiety in the room. Now, when we think about a non-anxious person, what are some of the characteristics that we think of? We can look both to this tool and also the way of Jesus that will teach us a lot about what living a non-anxious life and having a non-anxious posture towards the world looks like. The first thing is being responsive over reactive. It would have been unkind and cruel for Jesus not to respond to the storm going around him. It would have been very unkind. But Jesus also, he responds to a need to his disciples. They say, Master, Master, we're going to drown. Or in another translation, it says, Master, we're lost. We're at the end of our rope. We've tried all of our resources. We need you. It would have been unkind for him not to respond. But the way he responded is key. Hidden in what they said is also, hey, do you even care that we're drowning right now? Do you even care what's going on? And I don't know about you, but when someone says something along the lines of that, I would get pretty defensive. I would tend to shrink back and say, what do you mean, do I even care? Jesus had done so much for them, and they had experienced so much with him, and it would have been easy for the human side of him to get really, really, really defensive. But instead, Jesus just responds with a question, which is semi-frustrating, as well as a very good moment for a teaching moment, because he's a rabbi. So Jesus was a person that was responsive, overreactive. He was also self-differentiated. And what I mean by that is that he was able not to not be defensive about the situation and to not absorb the anxiety of the room. Jesus also knew who he was better than anyone else, and he knew what he was supposed to do. His convictions remained the same despite the environment that he was in. What might that teach us? And in the same way, a non-anxious person, so looking to Jesus as the example, is compassionate, not coercive. It is easy when people around you are not doing what you want them to do to try and manipulate them into a certain reaction. And Jesus is much the opposite of that in this circumstance. So Jesus is self-differentiated, a non-anxious person is. A non-anxious person is responsive, not reactive. Jesus is that. And also, Jesus was curious, which is why he asked that question. I think the tendency, like when you think about a stressful situation, we can read, "Where is your faith?" with Jesus with a harsh tone, but I don't really imagine it like that. I imagine him calmly asking the question, "Where is your faith?" So through this understanding of faith in this particular circumstance that Jesus is giving us, is that one of the things it tells us is that a mature faith is expressed through the ability to have peace in the midst of chaos. To be able to look at the chaos going on around us and to respond with a non-anxious, peaceful posture. Now, I don't know about you, but all this sounds great, and all these tools sound great, but how does that work itself out in our life? One of the things that I think a non-anxious, peaceful posture can offer to others around us is safety. And I've seen that happen in the work that I do with the nonprofit I work with, Treehouse. This past summer, we had a kid come for the first time who had moved from a different city to one of our programs, and he was visibly anxious and timid. One of the most, I would say, out of the years that I've worked with teens. But I have seen through consistent effort and through consistent showing up, I have seen his anxious and timid posture turn to a very calm, carefree posture where he feels like he can just be a kid in this environment. So I've seen ways in which our way of showing up in the world, our non-anxious, calm posture, peaceful posture, can transform the lives of those around us. And I think the question for us today is, who can we offer that presence to? Often when we have that kind of a posture and approach life with the kind of posture that Jesus had in this circumstance, not only do we provide safety to people around us, but we also provide people with the gift of us just simply being present. And I can't think of a more aware or perceptive or present person than Jesus and the example he gave. We hear all these different stories. One of my favorite is when he's in a crowd and he notices a woman tugging at his robe. Jesus was aware of what was going on around him, and he gives us that example to be able to do the same thing. Now, a lot of this does not matter if we do not first have the same peace that Jesus had in our lives. We can practice all these tools, we can use them to the best of our abilities, but at the end of the day, we need the same peace that Jesus has in order to accomplish this. Now, I said that there were two questions in this passage. There's two different questions. So there's, where is your faith? And who is this? Which is the question that the disciples ask. So at the very end of the passage, they say, who is this? He commands even the winds and the water, and they obey him. So I think out of any passage I've read in a while, this passage shows the mystery of who Jesus is better than any. Because again, at the beginning, he's taking a nap, and at the end, he calms a whole body of water. Like, get you a rabbi that can do both, right? But anyway, I think there is human limitation shown, coupled with absolute divine authority. The kind of authority that only the Creator God has. This one line pulls us back to Genesis chapter 1, where God's shalom, that earlier we read about, creates order from chaos. And that is exactly what the writer is intending us to see in the midst of this treacherous storm. That though there's chaos going on around him, Jesus' absolute divine authority is not only able to just give us that inner stability in the face of a lot of chaos, but it also restores and rebuilds the broken pieces of our lives. That it mends broken relationships, God's shalom, and that it puts together the brokenness of the world around us. Now, God wants this peace for us and for others, but he also wants it for the entire world. So peace is not just about this inner stability or the absence of conflict. It's also about the wholeness of the entire world, of it being completely restored back to Eden. We've been talking about the Sermon on the Mount and what it looks like to live out the way of Jesus in this world. And our kind of theme about Advent is heaven on earth. And so when we look at the beginning of Genesis, that is precisely the goal of where Jesus is bringing us back to, is Eden, of this new Eden where heaven and earth are in complete harmony with one another, that God is walking with us, that we are partnering together in creation. That is what shalom looks like. So I think often, like when we're talking about being able to differentiate from the most anxious person in the room, it can be easy for us to think that avoidance or removal is the easiest part. That I can just avoid this person. But sometimes that's not possible. And most of the time, it's not possible. It's necessary sometimes. Hear me say that. But most of the time, it is not possible. So I want you to think about this week, what would it look like for you to enter into relationships in your life, at work, or with family, or in other places in your life, to have the non-anxious posture and presence that Jesus had? Because that is what shalom looks like in our world, is the ability to stare at chaos, to see the ensuing chaos around us, and to respond peacefully and to respond calmly. Now, this is like a muscle. It's not something that happens instantaneously. Just like the disciples, in the face of great danger, great danger and chaos around us, we will not always respond as Jesus did. But that is what Jesus was wanting to grow in the disciples, is a mature faith that is expressed in the ability to have peace in the midst of great chaos. So I will ask you to take some moments to kind of discuss. Burped. But to take some time to kind of discuss around your tables, and then we'll go into worship after that. So